Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, March 10th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. President Biden has put in his request for the 2024 military budget, and he is asking for $886 billion. So this would be for fiscal year 2024, and $842 billion of this amount would go to the Pentagon, and then the remaining 40 billion or so would go to other federal agencies for their military spending, including the Energy Department's nuclear weapons program, which is one of the big ones. So there's been this pattern over the past 2 years where Biden requests, military spending levels, and then Congress turns around and gives him much more than he asked for. So for the 2023 budget, Biden asked for 813 billion, which is a huge amount of money, and then Congress added 45 billion dollars to that. So for this year's NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, was 858 billion. So now Biden is asking for 886 billion for next year's. So I think it's safe to say that Congress is going to probably bring that number at least over 900 billion. And this means, we're closing in on that $1 trillion a year military budget. Just, and if you factor in Ukraine aid, because that's something that's not included with these NDAAs, if they keep spending on Ukraine at these same levels, I mean, that's about $100 billion a year. So that brings it over $1 trillion. And already, if you consider the intelligence agencies and other spending that goes into maintaining, this global empire, I think it's safe to say that that is already over $1 trillion a year. But just to have the actual NDAA, reach $1 trillion, I mean, it's just so much money. So that's where we're at now. So the White House requested it. And then, there's a long way between now and the time they pass the next NDAA. The House and the Senate usually make their own version, and then they reconcile it between each other. And then, that's what it is. So again, I'm expecting them to really increase it. And in a statement on the request, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that the funds were needed to confront China, which the Pentagon has identified as its top priority. Austin said in a statement, quote, "The president's budget request provides the resources necessary to address the pacing challenge from the People's Republic of China, address advanced and persistent threats, accelerate innovation and modernization, and ensure operational resiliency amidst our changing climate," end quote. So that was his little statement on it, and a lot of this, one thing that they're spending a lot of money on, and they say that they need to, to face China, is what they call, research and development, and that's the research and development of new weapons technology, of advanced weapons, like things like AI and robotics and hypersonics and space weapons and scary things like that. So this budget is going to include $145 billion for that. And according to Responsible Statecraft, more than half of this $880 billion, or whatever the final amount will be, is going to go directly to defense contractors. And the top five are going to make out the best. The top five are Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon, who is the former employer of Lloyd Austin. He was a Raytheon board member before joining Biden's Pentagon. All right, the next one here. The DNI says that China should know the U.S. will defend Taiwan. So this is Avril Haines, and she is the director of national intelligence. She said on Thursday that China should know the U.S. is willing to go to war over Taiwan, pointing to comments made by President Biden that he would defend the island in the event of a Chinese attack. Haines made the remarks at a House Intelligence Committee hearing when asked by Representative Chris Stewart, he's a Republican from Utah, if she thinks the U.S. should change its policy of strategic ambiguity over the question of defending Taiwan. She said, quote, "I think it is clear to the Chinese what our position is based on the president's comments," end quote. So in September 2022, President Biden was asked if American men and women, he was asked very explicitly if the US would defend Taiwan. He said yes. And then he was asked, "You mean American men and women would be deployed to fight China for Taiwan?" And he replied again, yes. And Biden has said this before. So again, this is September 2022. I believe it's like the fourth time he said it. So the White House, the first three times, walked it back. This time, they didn't really walk it back. They just said that the policy hasn't changed. That doesn't really mean much. And then Kurt Campbell, who is Biden's top Asia official on the National Security Council, said at the time that the president's comments speak for themselves. So, um, this policy of strategic ambiguity has been how the U.S. handles this situation between China and Taiwan. It's what they've done for decades, since ending the mutual defense treaty that they had with Taiwan. And that ended shortly after the U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979. So after that, the U.S. had no commitment to defend Taiwan, but they wouldn't say one way or another if China attacked, if the U.S. would intervene. So to China, the threat has always been there, but they weren't sure. And that is kind of the point of strategic ambiguity. It serves two purposes. China doesn't really know what the cost of an invasion will be, and Taiwan would not be emboldened to take any action that would provoke a Chinese attack. Well, that seems to have all, been shredded by President Biden. Although Biden administration officials, they still insist that there hasn't been a change in policy, in official US policy, but they have made clear, it's very clear now, I think, that unlike in Ukraine, Biden would directly intervene with troops in a Taiwan conflict to fight China despite the risk of nuclear war. And this is something I've been noticing a lot lately. US officials, US military officials, these hearings that they've been having on China this week in Congress have been very alarming. The way that they talk about how if China invades, yeah, we'll be fighting a war with China. They're talking about direct war with China. And just like a direct war with Russia, that can't happen because they have nukes and we have nukes. China doesn't have nearly as many as the US and Russia do, but they have a few hundred, and that's enough to start an exchange that could, end the world potentially. So it's just very, very concerning, all this stuff. So Haynes, she also said at the hearing, which was interesting, that it's not, U.S. intelligence assessment that China wants to go to war over Taiwan. Despite all these, kind of hysterical claims we're hearing here, she says that they don't think China wants to risk to deal with that. For China's part, their official stance is that they seek peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but they don't rule out the use of force. And China has been, as I'm always covering, they're increasing military pressure on Taiwan, but that's a direct correlation with the U.S. increasing their support for Taiwan. So the next one here, this is kind of more of this. This is a U.S. commander who says the U.S. must focus on sinking Chinese ships in a future war. And this is the head of U.S. Pacific Air Forces, which I believe is based in Japan. It said on Wednesday that the U.S. needs to focus on sinking Chinese ships in a potential conflict with China, as U.S. military leaders are speaking more bluntly about a direct war with Beijing. So this is General Kenneth Wilsbach. He said the need to focus on sinking ships was the lesson of China's response to Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. When she visited part of their huge military exercises that they held, the Chinese military simulated a blockade around Taiwan. They closed off 6 areas around the island, and they fired missiles over it. And they were able to do this really quick. And I think it did wake a lot of people up, myself included, that it's not just a Chinese invasion of Taiwan that could be the military action. It could be something like a blockade. Could be a move on the islands that they control on the southeastern mainland, because it's not in China's interest to invade Taiwan. There's so many things that could go wrong. It's such a hard thing to do, an amphibious invasion of this island. It would be the largest in history. And, Taiwan's been preparing for this. So, and they have great trade relations with Taiwan. I mean, a blockade would probably, affect that, but this could be kind of, if things do get to this point, years down the line. I don't think this will happen anytime soon. Maybe China does the blockade to see what the response is. And here we have, this general, he's not saying if they do a blockade, we should sink the ships. He's saying if, we're fighting a war with China over Taiwan, we have to be focus on sinking ships. And, he said, Wilsbach, he said that the US wants to focus on deterring China from attacking Taiwan, but deterrence looks a lot like provocation, similar to what the US and NATO were doing in Ukraine from 2014 on, and going back before that, of course, the coup and the expansion of NATO. All this stuff is done in the name of deterrence, but really it's provocation, and that's clear now. Just based on China's action and their rhetoric, they're making it very clear. They're telling the U.S., if you keep doing this, there's going to be a war. Talking more broadly about U.S. policy in the Asia Pacific, but still specifically Taiwan. So that's that there. And the next one, the U.S. Navy wants to turn Australia into a full-service submarine hub. So the U.S. Navy is envisioning that Australia will become this submarine hub that can oversee all underwater activity in the Asia Pacific, including production and repairs. And this was from Defense News. And they spoke with Navy Secretary Carlos del Toro, and his vision will be possible under AUKUS, which is the military pact signed between the US, Britain, and Australia in 2021 as part of an effort to build alliances against China. AUKUS focuses on technology sharing and will give Australia access to American and British nuclear-powered submarine technologies. Del Toro said that AUKUS is about, quote, being able to repair our submarines much further out, being able to build them in Australia as well, and create that much more presence in the Indo-Pacific where we need it the most, end quote. So President Biden, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, they are expected to unveil the details of these AUKUS submarine deals on Monday during a meeting that's going to be held aboard a submarine in San Diego. So Australia is expected their first move under this deal, according to reports, is that they're going to buy American Virginia-class attack submarines. And those are going to be delivered in the early 2030s, so not for a while. Australia will then purchase a new British-designed submarine called the SSN AUKUS that's expected to arrive in the 2040s. And the ultimate goal for Australia is going to be building its own SSN AUKUS submarines with US or British-provided nuclear propulsion. Over the next few decades, Canberra is expected to spend over $100 billion on this plan. So again, it's a very long-term plan. And the submarines that Australia is going to acquire are not expected to be armed with nuclear weapons, but that could always change. They are nuclear powered, but either way, China views this as provocative because what are these submarines going to be used for? They're going to be used to patrol the waters of the South China Sea, around Taiwan, other areas near China. That's what this is all about. And since signing AUKUS, the U.S. has said that they will deploy more troops and aircraft to Australia, including nuclear-capable B-52 bombers. They're currently building facilities to house more B-52 bombers in northern Australia, up in Darwin there. All right. So that's it for the China stuff. The next one here, the media dumps stories on the Nord Stream sabotage. So, man, since the New York Times published a story on Tuesday that cited U.S. officials who claimed the bombings of the Nord Stream pipelines were conducted by a pro-Ukrainian group, articles have appeared across Western media making similar allegations. So all these stories, I went over the New York Times one earlier this week, but there's been a lot since then. And they come after about a month since Seymour Hersh's report that said President Biden ordered the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines, which are natural gas pipelines that connect Russia to Germany. The New York Times report only mentioned Hirsch's report to say U.S. officials denied its allegations. And since the New York Times reported on the pipeline sabotage, articles reinforcing the narrative, the very vague narrative that was, these U.S. officials saying that they can't disclose any information about this intelligence, but we know it was a pro-Ukrainian group. They might have been Ukrainians, they might have been Russians. We don't know. But so there's been articles to reinforce that narrative that have appeared in German media, in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, and many other outlets. This is all over. And kind of, I couldn't get into each individual story. A lot of them are similar. They have some different details, but I linked to a few big ones here if you want to go check them out. It's just too much nonsense, it seems like. But piecing them together, the general narrative is that a group of private individuals with ties to Ukraine, but not the government, carried out the attack using a yacht owned by a Ukrainian. That's really it. And before these new allegations, the theory among Western investigators, according to what they were all saying right after the explosion and up until pretty recently, was that it was likely carried out by state actors due to the amount of explosives. I linked to a quote from a Finnish official who says, "Yeah, there's no way people just got on a fishing boat and were able to plant all these, explosives." So now the story though is that they were on a yacht, and very sophisticated operations would involve that. And Hirsch's report said it was U.S. Navy divers that planted the explosives during NATO exercises in the Baltic Sea in June 2022. So even without Hirsch's report, the U.S. is still a prime suspect just because it has the motive to destroy the pipelines and it has the capabilities, and it has a lot of capabilities. There's a lot of ways the U.S. I think could have done this. I was surprised that Hirsch's report because it was, the U.S. military doing it. I always kind of thought maybe it was the U.S. did it, or ordered it, but did it by proxy. So that's why his report. I mean, either way, if the U.S. did it, it's an act of war against Russia. But that's why his report is such a bombshell. And I think they're trying to, spin this new narrative that doesn't really make much sense. So I think we're just going to see more of this. They're just trying to muddy the waters here because this is all just anonymous officials. It seems like it's very coordinated. All the media in the different countries, their intelligence officials saying similar things. So we'll see how this all plays out. All right, the next one here. Russia launches a barrage of missile strikes across Ukraine. So Russia has launched a series of missile strikes across Ukraine on Thursday in one of the heaviest Russian bombardments in weeks. The strikes targeted energy infrastructure. Ukraine's prime minister said that power facilities were hit in 8 regions of Ukraine. So more Ukrainians having to deal with, their power going out and losing water and things like that. Ukrainian authorities said that the strikes also hit residential buildings. Russia said the strikes also targeted Ukrainian military facilities. The Russian Defense Ministry said that the strikes were launched in retaliation over an attack in Russia's Bryansk Oblast, which borders Ukraine. And they said hypersonic missiles were used in this bombardment. So if you're watching the video here, this is a map from South Front, and they have marked kind of where these strikes were reported. It's all across Ukraine. It hit Odessa, Kiev, other major cities. I believe the Ukrainians said 6 people were killed in these strikes. Heaviest ones in a while. And they're saying it was a response to that cross-border raid. And Moscow accused Ukrainian saboteurs of killing 2 civilians in this attack in Bryansk. Kiev denied being responsible, but it's very weird. This group that has taken responsibility for it, it's the Russian Volunteer Corps, and they have been fighting. They are fighting for Ukraine. They're part of Ukraine's territorial defense forces. And the group's leader, this is according to the Financial Times. Basically these are Russian Nazis. It sounds like. And Denis Nikitin, I probably said his name wrong, but he's the group's leader. And he said, they did the raid. He said that they did it with the backing of the Ukrainian government. And according to the Financial Times, this guy is considered as a notorious extremist, and he has ties to neo Nazis and white nationalists across the Western world. And he's Russian. He was born in Russia, but he's been in Ukraine for a while fighting for Ukraine. And the Russian Volunteer Corps is part of Ukraine's territorial defense forces and was formed in 2022. It is made up of Russians who have been fighting for Ukraine since 2014, including former members of the neo Nazi Azov Regiment. And according to Unheard, they have a report about them. Elements of the group are overtly sympathetic to neo Nazi ideology and praise Hitler on Telegram. So that is what that group is about. I think the Ukrainian government is trying to deny that. Again, though, they are part of that Ukraine Territorial Defense Force, but I guess they're just trying to deny that they were involved in that attack. All right. So the next one here, Saudi Arabia seeks U.S. security guarantees for Israel ties. Saudi Arabia wants the U.S. to provide formal security guarantees and help the kingdom develop a nuclear program as part of a potential deal to normalize relations with Israel. This is according to a report from the Wall Street Journal. So both Biden and Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, have been pushing hard for Israeli normalization with Riyadh, with Saudi Arabia. And this is all part of that effort to build a regional alliance against Iran. Since Israel signed normalization deals with the UAE and Bahrain in 2020, the countries have expanded military cooperation. So the Saudis, they've been acting like they're going to be, a tough nut to crack when it comes to normalizing with Israel, saying that they've long, demanded a Palestinian state as a precondition to normalization. But the Wall Street Journal report, which cited people involved in the normalization talks, it said that Riyadh could be flexible on the issue. They said that a deal could be reached only if Israel enters peace talks with the Palestinians. That's it. They just have to start talking about this stuff. But that does seem very unlikely right now, as tensions are really high, in the West Bank with this new Netanyahu government. But still, that seems to be a pretty big concession from statehood to just talking about it. And so the security guarantees, that would be a huge deal. And that could face opposition. The fact that Saudi Arabia, wants the U.S. to guarantee that it will, come to their defense if they're attacked. And that could face some serious opposition in Congress. Some members of Congress have come out against arms sales against the Saudis in recent years. A big part of it is due to their brutal tactics in Yemen. And pledging to come to Riyadh's defense, of course, it's going to threaten the U.S. getting sucked into yet another conflict in the Middle East. But one option being considered would be to designate Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally. And that would give the Saudis more access to U.S. arms. And I think there is a way that the Biden administration could sell this to Congress. I think ultimately, that opposition to Saudi Arabia, to the partnership, is kind of fading. The Democrats were really mad at them because they cut oil production right before the elections. But, you haven't heard anything about that recently. But the way I think the Biden administration would sell this to Congress, they're going to say, this is how we maintain influence in the region without keeping like a huge presence. And this is the way we counter China because, part of the strategy now, the talking points about the U.S. policy in the Middle East is keeping the region, free of Chinese and not free of their influence because that's impossible, but to try to, mitigate their influence, I guess. And, Saudi Arabia, Xi Jinping just went to Saudi Arabia and they declared that they will increase cooperation. You have the Saudis talking about selling them oil using China's currency, which is a big threat to the petrodollar. I think a big part of that, I think the Saudis have a strategy there, and they're really probably doing a lot of that so they can make more demands of the U.S. And again, I think that's a way, you could get these people in Congress to sign off on this. They say we can, scale back from the region. Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, they're all going to work together against Iran. They could all fight them in a war. Um, so it's not a good situation. And they call these normalization deals peace deals, but Israel and Saudi Arabia aren't at war. These are really arms deals. The UAE was rewarded with a huge arms deal. That hasn't all gone through yet, the F-35 deal, but still, I mean, that's what a lot of this is about. And then concerning the nuclear program, so Saudi Arabia has been after, a U.S. sponsored, nuclear program for a while, and they want the U.S. to help them enrich uranium and develop a fuel production system, for civilian use. The report said that U.S. and Israeli officials were concerned that this could eventually lead to Saudi Arabia making a nuclear weapon. And I just mentioned in the article that the U.S. helped Iran launch its nuclear program back in the 1950s. And it has never been weaponized despite constant claims. And the Pentagon and the CIA recently acknowledged that Iran is not trying to build a nuclear bomb. But you see Israeli officials say, oh, if the Saudis get a bomb, then it's going to start a nuclear arms race in the region. But, that always omits the fact that Israel already has, nuclear weapons. They just don't want to talk about it. But that's it. We left up a couple things from yesterday, but that's all the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Daniel Larison. Biden's Iran policy does not make sense. And I would agree with that. One from Norman Solomon. Israel's liberal supporters are taking their denial to a new level. And we have Ramsey Baroud. Victory is defeat. Palestinian children's art exposes Israel's cultural genocide. One from David Gordon over at the Mises Institute. Imperialist nonsense, the U.S. takeover of the Philippines. And this is interesting. I didn't realize Robert Kagan just put out a new book recently. But in it, he defends, U.S. actions in the Philippines and the U.S. imperialism in the Philippines, which was very, very brutal in the early 20th century. Torture and concentration camps, and hundreds of thousands of people, Filipinos, were killed, and something a lot of people don't know about. But it's kind of a rebuttal to Robert Kagan's. Of course, Kagan didn't endorse the brutality of it, but of course, he says it was all good, I guess, ultimately. And then the spotlight is from Aramante over at his Substack. In Nord Stream attack, U.S. officials use proxy media to blame proxy Iran. So go check that out. But that's it for today. That's it for the week. I will be back after the weekend. Go to antiwar.com/donate to support us. Like and subscribe to this on YouTube and Odyssey and Rumble. On Rumble, I noticed that I've been relying on the sync. Like, I upload it to YouTube and it's supposed to sync to Rumble. I just noticed a few videos never made it over there. So I'm going to make sure to upload them on my own. So all the content gets on Rumble. But anyway, that's it for me. I'll talk to you after the weekend. Thank you for listening.